Daniel Levy, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
You can, Martin. So my name's Daniel Levy. I'm speaking to you from London. I am currently the president of the US Middle East Project, which is an organization established out of the Council of Foreign Relations in New York that became independent. The focus of the work is Palestine, Israel, is achieving an equitable peace. We look more broadly at the region. My background, I'm a Brit, but I moved to Israel after college, took citizenship, did my military service. During that time, I was on the negotiating team under then Prime Minister Rabin in the mid-90s on the Oslo Accords, on the Oslo B specifically. I later worked as an advisor to Israeli politicians on the center-left, Yossi Beilin, who was then Justice Minister. When Ehud Barak formed the government in 1999, I went to work with a minister in the Prime Minister's office, was on the Israeli negotiating team at the end of that time in the Taba talks, and have subsequently headed up Middle East work at some think tanks, at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and now this current position.
You have been very, very prominent over the last 2 years in expressing what I think for many of us, particularly Jews among us, or as Jews at the beginning of the Gaza operations, was a voice that was very, very rare and very difficult to find, which was really a very clear, a bit of a clarion call against what at that point already, like in early October 2023, really looked like it was a disaster unfolding. I wonder if you can take me a bit back as to how your ideas through Zionism developed, especially being somebody that was pretty much watching, I suppose, the failure of the two-state solution from the first row.
Yeah, and I guess I could have gone back further in introducing myself, Martin, and mentioned that when I finished college and the stepping stone for my immediate move to Israel and to become Israeli from the UK was that I was working for the Jewish student organization in the UK, the Union of Jewish Students, and I actually put my candidacy forward and was elected as head of the World Union of Jewish Students when I was very young. And so that was the context in which I moved to Israel, was immediately very politically involved, was exposed to working with organizations like the World Zionist Organization, the World Jewish Congress. And my feeling was that this is where the Jewish story was being played out and that we could make a difference, that change was possible there. It was just after the Gulf War. It was during still the Intifada. The first Intifada hadn't really come to a close. And within 1 year of moving to Israel, what feels like a very encouraging development takes place. Rabin comes into power. There's strong support for the kind of left Zionist Meretz party. They form a government. There are secret talks with the PLO. And it feels like this is the breakthrough and we will get there. And of course, that's not how it plays out. And the story of that 30-year interregnum from the signing of the first Oslo Agreement in September 1993 until October 2023, and what happens subsequently is a moment of, I think, unprecedented, perhaps, clarity in terms of whether Zionism could get to a place where Palestinian legitimate existence, let alone sovereignty, acceptance of Palestinians was really possible. And the feeling is that the Israeli regime looked over the precipice at this possibility and decided no, and walked it back. And having gone through that, and of course, having been shocked by the criminality of the actions on October 7th, right? I mean, I think for many of us who are Israeli and know people and are in regular contact, I knew so many people who spent the days after October 7th at funerals. It was the demographic that was most immediately impacted. But at the same time, we also immediately heard from Israel's leaders what their intentions were. And unfortunately, it came as no surprise. So when the very first reaction, in fact, before we even knew the magnitude, was we will cut their food, fuel, water, electricity, when there was the immediate apportioning of blame to the entirety of the Palestinian population, when the intention of pursuing what had already been done elsewhere in this Dahia doctrine, where you destroy the civilian infrastructure and residences, but the clear statement was, we are going to do this in an unprecedented fashion. When the former head of the Labour Party, the now president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, makes that early statement that there are no innocents, there's no distinction between combatant and civilian, we knew where this was going. And hence, one had to make that really difficult but very quick transition into saying, don't pretend there's no context previous to October 7th. Decades of occupation, of course, generates resistance. Don't pretend that October 7th is legitimate, it's criminal. But for heaven's sake, don't allow this to now become a moment of horrendous cruelty to the Palestinian population. And that's what it became.
There is something I heard Gideon Levy say probably a few months after October 7th, but he said something like, if this is what October 7th has done to the Israelis, I shiver in thinking what something like 70 years of October 7th have done to the Palestinian, or 70 years of occupation has done to the Palestinians. And it is really remarkable, sort of the blind spot which occupies essentially an entire historical horizon concerning even 2023, right? I mean, in mid-2023, you had a bombing in mid-May of Gaza, in which people were killed. There were reports of amnesty that came out on war crimes being committed in May, June. And these things really seem to have completely faded. In fact, somehow the public discourse, the Israeli articulation of what happened, is one that essentially prevailed.
Absolutely. October 6th was a normal day for Israelis. The fact that Palestinians existed in a permanent state of denial of rights, denial of basic freedoms across the occupied territories. Palestinians inside Israel itself lived in a second-class status, structurally discriminated against. The fact that this was now being recognized globally as an apartheid system. The fact that if you were a Gazan born when Israel imposed its siege and blockade after 2006, 2007, you were getting ready to graduate high school, having lived your entire life in this tiny area under blockade. All of this was of absolutely no interest to the vast majority of Israelis. Their life was normal. In fact, the normalization of the abnormal had never gone so far. Even with the Abraham Accords, the idea that Israel could get away with treating Palestinians however it wanted, with total impunity. And in the months leading up to October 7th, you even had this phenomenon. It was, the press was writing about the pogroms. That was the language that was being used in terms of settler violence. But of course, there's really no such thing as settler violence divorced from the state and the permissive environment created by the state, created by the IDF, which arms and protects those settlers. So the idea that all of this was normal and that it could just carry on in perpetuity without blowback. And October 7th comes along. And it's, where did that come from? Who could possibly have thunk it? And of course, you cannot maintain the perpetual, it doesn't justify anything, not on any side, but you cannot expect anywhere in history, in geography, to maintain that kind of a regime of structural violence against another people without that violence blowing back in your face. And yet, that idea has almost zero resonance inside an Israeli society where consent for the total dehumanization and then genocidal campaign against Palestinians has become so widespread that even Martin, when, there have been endless inquiries, endless investigations inside Israel on how did it happen. Yes, the prime minister has avoided establishing a blue ribbon state commission of inquiry with an independent judge. That's a huge issue inside Israel. To me, it really is a total irrelevance and sideshow, because so many of these inquiries have been established to look at each location, the kibbutzim, where the festival was in Rem. So in each of those, internal Israeli inquiries has failed to ask the most important question. Each of them have been about the chain of command and who was informed and when were they informed and why wasn't this military force moved from place A to place B and why did it take so long? And none of them have asked the question, how did you expect to maintain this kind of regime and achieve security? None of them have looked at the bigger picture, because Israel refuses to look at that picture, and it's enabled, it's facilitated in that refusal by the impunity with which it is treated globally. And if Israel's allies consider decades of occupation, decades of structural violence, and an apartheid regime to be normal, then why shouldn't Israelis consider it to be normal?
I wanted to ask you what, before we get into the more nitty-gritty political questions, how do you think of Israel, and probably more broadly, how do you think of Zionism today? I mean, it's a question that Avram Burg in conversation corrected me promptly and told me it's just a silly question. But let me ask you then a silly question.
So I'm going to disagree with my friend Avram in terms of it being a silly question. And actually, the very first political thing I did when I moved to Israel was to go around in 1992 in Avrum's, being pretty useless, really. I could just write stuff for him in English at that time, but go around in his primary campaign where he comes kind of top of the Labour primaries. So he's someone who I have a great deal of warmth and respect and personal affinity towards. But I think actually the question of Zionism has come front and center. Also, by the way, I think globally, people have, because there has been such a mobilization around this issue in the last 2 years, people have wanted to understand. I don't want to generalize, say everyone, but in many places, you have seen a generation for whom this is their Vietnam, if you like. And it's not just because they're obsessed with Israel or a Jewish state. It's not because what's happening here is so unique. I think it's because it has become an avatar almost of the inequities of the world we live in today, and of the failings and hypocrisy and double standards and contempt in which political leaderships hold their own publics.
Yes, I think that's actually an excellent point. I would add also that, I mean, within the Jewish community, beyond the confines of the state of Israel, it is an absolutely central question. As a matter of fact, it might be the question of the Jewish post-war project in this context.
I think it is, Martin. I think, and we're having this conversation during the festival of Hanukkah and just after the events in Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. And for me and for many people I've been speaking to, this felt like a moment of intensified urgency that we had to mourn and feel a huge pain. I mean, for the British Jewish community, the ties with Australia actually run very deep, and we know people who come here from there or who've gone from here to live there, and people who were at that location. And at the same time as feeling, this is a horrendous development. At the same time, we know how this is so instrumentalized by Israel, by its Amen corner, and how the Jewish establishment refuses to see that the way Israel behaves, and then the way it is embraced and endorsed, to have communal establishment leaderships. It doesn't justify the killing, of course not, but to have communal establishment leaderships embracing Israel's genocidal actions is terrible news and terribly dangerous. And so many of us are looking at this and saying, how do we push back? How do we offer a different way of thinking about this? How do we reclaim the centrality of our own Jewish communal well-being distant from Israel? Because Israel, and here it gets back to your question about the relevance of a conversation about Zionism. Because Zionism, in its distilled essence, is the negation of the idea that Jews can live a full life outside of a Jewish state. There was always a close relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism. And Zionism basically said, we can't cure anti-Semitism. There's no point trying to maintain healthy Jewish communal life in any of these places. Give up. You can't be a British Jew. Don't be ridiculous. An Argentinian Jew, a French Jew. We have to have our own place, and that's the end of the Zionist conversation. Now, since then, of course, Zionism, people claim, oh, it's just like motherhood and apple pie. How could anyone oppose Zionism? Why should Jews not have the right to self-determination if everyone else does? It's a lot more complicated than that. And as I was starting and then went off on a tangent to say, in the last 2 years, well, good. Then we'll get on well, because I'm a man of far too many tangents, unfortunately. But one of the things that's happened is people have explored what was previously unspoken in Jewish settings, and of course in the broader global and conversation in all kinds of places, which is they've interrogated, what is this ideology? What is this regime under which Palestinians are perpetually denied these freedoms? Can Zionism come to terms with living at peace in its neighborhood? And I may yearn for a benign version of the idea of a Jewish presence there, of the idea of some kind of Jewish national interest. But the record book says that Zionism can't do that. And therefore, what do we do? And I take very seriously the community, the tradition, the history into which I was born, what went on with my own family. Historically, a grandmother I was very close to who got out of Austria after the Anschluss. And if one takes that seriously, one also has to take seriously that plus minus 40% of the Jewish population in the world today lives in Israel. So you have to take very seriously, what is the future for the Israeli Jewish community? And that can be a settler colonial community as an accurate historic description. I think it is an accurate historic description, but it doesn't mean that the alternative to a zero-sum outcome in which Palestinians are negated is a zero-sum outcome in which Jewish Israelis are negated. So we have to come to terms with what is the Jewish Israeli future, because I don't think Zionism serves Jewish Israelis, and it sure as hell doesn't serve Jews elsewhere.
I mean, I guess I did want to touch last. I mean, I said probably about 10 minutes ago that it was the last question on this before politics, but I think that one of the things that has become really brutally clear and if I, for a very long time, I held this intuition. What Gaza did to a very large extent is show that there is an essential incompatibility between what I consider to be Jewish values, growing up with ideas of B'Tselem Hashem and growing up with ideas of Emet and Tzedek and
Tikkun Olam.
And Tikkun Olam. So repair the world, I should translate because most of the public will not know.
Yes.
Like, Tikkun Olam is a repairing, or the task of the individual in collaborating with the repair of the world, like making the world right. And Emet is truth, and Tzedek is justice, and B'Tselem is being made in the image of God, which in an atheist like myself, it's translation. I mean, obviously an atheist Jew. So there is only one God, and I don't believe in him, as they say. Or her, indeed. But I think that the point is that the idea of this dignity is completely incompatible with a lot of what I have known since the first time I heard about Deir Yassin or Sabra and Shatila. But what we have now is a full catalog of horrors, which it's not just that it's no compatibility. It's that in some sense, what I've been seeing, and I think that perhaps this is a reason for my reaction to the last 2 years, is that they attempt directly against not my sense only of humanity and ethical disposition, values, etc., but my Judaism, I feel, is being attacked. I mean, I don't know.
Sorry, Martin.
No. Go ahead.
No, I think you just articulated what far more of us are feeling and thinking and interrogating and going through than would appear to be the case. I think the tumult, I think the upheaval, I think what's a really good thing, the grappling that is going on inside people, but also in Jewish conversations, I think that is so misrepresented by legacy Jewish communal establishment organizations. I think they are doing such a disservice to the heterogeneity and to the moment of crisis that so many of us are going through. And here they stand up, they say, we speak for the Jewish community of fill in the blank, country X, and we are foursquare behind Israel, and this is all about anti-Semitism, and shut up, we're going to cancel you if you question any of this, and we are happy to be used as the battering ram to make our whole society less open, less freedom of speech, less ability to protest, less ability to question.
Which incidentally not only reflects on the internal dynamics of the Jewish community, but actually, as a representative or putative representative of the Jews, gives the Jew in those democratic spaces an absolute terrible image. I mean, in Argentina right now, we're seeing the main organizations of the Jewish community openly suing and threatening with legal actions against random citizens for expressing only solidarity with the children of Gaza. That's
exactly. And in so many places, this is replicated. And it's this not even just willingness, it's this enthusiasm on the part of Israel, and it's our men corner and so much of the legacy establishment communal groups. It's this enthusiasm to say, yes, we want to be a tool of the most repressive organs of the state to be used against the rest of the citizenry, and somehow to think that this ends up well for the Jews. That this, first of all, somehow to think that this is the correct way to read the legacy of Jewish history, that this is the correct way to interpret Jewish experience, Jewish texts, that this is in the interests of the communities they claim to represent, and even that this is a consensus position, because none of those things are true. And they are doing, disservice is too gentle a word. They are endangering. And I think this is the word that has to come to the forefront now. I think those of us who challenge this have to own in and I'm saying this again, very much in the shadow of Bondi Beach, we now have to own a far more robust, assertive pushback. No, you are endangering
Yeah,
Jewish well-being. You are making us a pariah. Our interest is not with whatever the state of Israel tells us, and the state of Israel does not give a damn. And I insist on that because I know it from within, and I know how it is instrumentalized. And by the way, I get it. Israel is a nation state. Israel is a state operating in the state system that is willing to deploy the things that work for Israel. So if the best line of Israeli defense is to endanger Jewish communities through this outrageously aggressive attempt to assert that X is anti-Semitic, and we're going to try and bring down an Australian government or a Brazilian government or a British government. And they don't care about the well-being of those countries for sure, but of the Jews in those countries.
right.
And any claim,
Talk
any
about
claim
human
to the
shield, right?
exactly, it's a form of human shield. Any claim to the contrary is just a bald-faced lie. So anyway, we have to own that. But you said a couple of other things, which if I may,
Of course.
because look, I think this is true of any religion. You can go back to the texts, and you can be a liberation Christian theologist, or you can be a settler colonial advancer of Christian white nationalism, right? You can take religious texts in any direction. The same is true in Islam, and the same, shock, horror, surprise, surprise, is true in Judaism. You can take this to the direction of all the land was promised to us, and you can find the examples, and you can read the text, and you can read the Haggadah on Pesach, and you can go, oh my God, what we're doing here is what they did then. And you can draw the completely opposite conclusions. And you could say, this is about a universal ethic. This is about an ethos that is, as you said, the things that we talked about earlier. And in fact, the founding ethos of the B'Tselem organization, that all people are created equal. You love the stranger. You work for repair in the world. And I think for many Jewish people now, it's the urgency of reclaiming some of those values. And of course, it doesn't just get filtered through the lens of Jewish text. It gets filtered through the lens of lived Jewish experience. And especially it gets filtered through the lens of, wait a minute, you guys want to keep deploying the Holocaust? Well, we learn a totally different lesson from the Holocaust. Never again, it was not never again for the Jews. Never again means never again for anyone. And so and we also see how counterproductive it is, this attempt to ram down everyone's throat. And you look, for instance, at the remarkable, scary popularity of someone like a Nick Fuentes.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, what's going on here?
Right. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
he's just been interviewed on Piers Morgan in a British speaking. I'm not really on social media, but I'm not cut off from the world enough to not be aware of this, right? So in a British speaking world, I think that's at 5 million views or something.
Yeah.
And one way of looking at that phenomenon is that it is a transgressive generational rebellion against having this rammed down your throats. And in a world in which there is so much cruelty and suffering, so many bad actors, this is the only one that gets held up in that way. And again, I think this is crazy for Jewish well-being. And the good news is that not only in Jewish communities everywhere do we see people say, wait, stop. Sure, we don't run the main Jewish organization that gets invited by the government when they want to say, well, we got to speak to the Jews. We may not run most of the synagogues. We may not run the media organ of the established community, but we are here. We are not going to shut up. We will probably be present at the Palestinian solidarity, anti-genocide,
Right.
pro-peace rallies. So if you don't call those hate marches against Jews, Jews are there. That's been the story in London
Well,
every
in Berlin, you're having sort of number of Jews just arrested and being like
week.
whisked away for
It's
protesting
remarkable.
against
Exactly. It's
Jewish party.
remarkable that here in Germany, I mean, the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors
Yeah,
being
being
arrested
taken
for
away by the grandchildren of Nazis.
exactly because the grandchildren of Nazis are supposedly
Better
protecting these
Jews,
Jews,
better
better
Jews,
Jews,
yeah,
better Jews.
better Jews than
Perfect.
the Jews themselves.
But the good news is not only is that phenomenon, I think, accelerating and certainly refusing to go away, but you're seeing also how some of it is going back and wanting to reclaim this in its Jewish essence. And I want to refer people, if there's a way of sharing this, to a group inside Israel, for instance, called Hasmol HaEmuni, the left faithful. And these are people who come out of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox homes who are challenging what's being done in Israel. And I don't want to paint a rosy picture and pretend that this is where the majority of the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox are going, but it's a challenge from within the heart of that establishment. There was a fabulous piece about Smoleh Muni, the religious faithful, the left faithful, it translates as, in Haaretz recently, which is well worth looking up.
I do tend to think that, probably because of the place in the world where I find myself. I mean, I live in Germany, I come from Argentina. A lot of my media presence is throughout Latin America. And I am very aware of the kind of public discourse concerning what the Jew is. The conflation that Hamas no longer makes, which is the Jew and Israel continues to make. So you do see, I think, the effect of that. But what I do think is really central, and sometimes it is perhaps lost. I wouldn't say, not on me, I would hope not on you, but certainly on people that are operating mostly within the space of Anglo-American Israeli discourse, is that the relevance of the Jewish voice that can say, no, this is not Judaism. This is certainly not my Judaism. Is really quite massive, precisely because it's not only the political system in places like Argentina, in places like Brazil, in places now like Chile. The what you were referring to as sort of the institutional Jewish voice is also the voice that has completely occupied the media space, which goes to show the importance of all these alternative channels. But I think that I was thinking of something you said a few minutes ago, which is, growing up in Argentina, in a country that had very, very clear, say, traces of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism that had been fed by Catholicism and by sort of Nazism and so on. I think it was very clear, and this is something that I got from my father, who remains for me probably one of the most important figures in terms of my understanding of the world. The fact that if we were Jews and we were not being conducted into gas chambers or being like killed in pogroms in Argentina, it's because we had democratic guarantees and legal guarantees that protected us. And insofar as we were a minority, Jews being a minority made us into almost, I would say, the barometer or the canary in the mine for the democratic health of the country. And this is something that with the best and most beloved of my Israeli friends, there is no point in common. They just do not understand what I'm talking about when I talk about Judaism and its difference and the considerable importance of rights. Because they are a majority, because the thought never crossed their mind that there could be something else.
And my friend Peter Beinart, a Jewish American author, intellectual, public intellectual, he makes this point very cogently and I think correctly, which is the precise thing that you just talked about, which we cling on to as our most important protective armor, those democratic guarantees of our rights. Why, when it comes to Israel, do we then have no interest in them and deny them in terms of the Palestinians, in terms of whether it's the Palestinians inside Israel and the structural discrimination there, whether it's the Palestinians in of course, in the occupied territories, living under an apartheid system, whether it's Palestinians on the outside, still in refugee camps, or who have refugee status, or who simply can't return or have that moment of some kind of closure. So I think that is exactly right. And then you dig down and you unpeel the onion, so to speak, in terms of those layers. And it's that denial of the realities in Israeli history. The fact that Israel today is trying to pursue a second Nakba without ever having acknowledged that it conducted that first Nakba, without acknowledging that what needs to be made good there. So we've gone from Nakba denial to Nakba repeat without going through this process of Nakba acknowledgement. And one of the things that I most reflect on, Martin, when I look back at that era, when I was involved, when we were in the room, and in Taba, we were doing the negotiations, when I was with Balin on the refugee issue. But throughout those negotiations, there was one thing that was never admissible, which was the idea of truth and reconciliation, of going through a transitional justice process. Because, of course, there have been crimes committed on all sides. But if you zoom out, then the great historical injustice towards the Jews was not committed by Palestinians, was not committed in that part of the world. And the great historic injustice towards the Palestinians was committed by the Zionist movement. And so there is a huge acknowledgement and coming to terms with, and that's something that apparently Zionism can't absorb. Let me touch on one other thing that you just said in terms of the relevance of the Jewish voice, because it has been so effectively asserted that these are the parameters of legitimate debate, and this wasn't by accident. That, for instance, this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the so-called IHRA definition, Israel knew that it was not going to a place where Palestinians would have their rights. Israel knew that it would only become more transparent that this was an apartheid system. And the main way it chose to defend itself against that in international, public, political, diplomatic discourse was by saying, we will go on a preemptive offensive. And they co-opted many, not all, in fact, the most important anti-Semitism, Holocaust, history scholars ended up coming out against the IHRA definition and offering an alternative. But they co-opted the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. But they co-opted this whole reframing of anti-Semitism. But there is a problem when we rely too exclusively on Jewish voices, and those voices, obviously, I think this, are really important to counter that, because we still then deny the permission to narrate from Palestinians. Palestinians have to be able to define and articulate and speak out, of course, on their own experience. But the other thing I would say is, this is, I think, something has happened in the last couple of years where some of this has become the avatar also of the inequities of the, what some people might call the post-colonial global system, except what's being exposed is it's not really post-colonial at all. So if you see what's gone on around the ICC, the International Criminal Court, so suddenly the court seeks to hold accountable an ally of the West, and America goes after the court in an unprecedented way. And I think we do live in a shifting geopolitical reality. And actually, again, this is one of the reasons why it's so short-sighted, irresponsible for Israel and Jewish communal establishments who align with Israel to go about things this way. Because that same ability to play the guilt card, to apply these things, doesn't carry through most of what is called the global south. And so we really need to think about how Israel appears in this respect, how Jews relate to that reality.
Right.
You mentioned Argentina, Chile, Brazil. Brazil, by the way, just walked back its endorsement of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is a really important move. But I think there's another question, which I imagine we won't go into here, which is for that continent, how one deals with Israel, with Palestine, with the mobilization, with what this tells us about the ethics and the geopolitics and the international architecture. That is all happening at a moment for your continent, for that continent, where we now have this renewed Don Roe doctrine. You know, how far into the continent does it go? This national security strategy paper that was released in December of 2025 of the US. And will people basically allow that continent to be ruled from Washington, D.C.? And if not, where in that, how do we think about the world and how do we reorganize the world and the architecture, the multilateral architecture and the systems of international law and justice? And again, that puts Palestine and Israel right front and center, because what we have seen is the collapsing of that architecture.
Matter of fact, I mean, one of the things that is most interesting about what you're seeing in this domino effect of far-right governments in Latin America is that one of the first things that they all do, besides going visit Jerusalem, is essentially to promise the move of their embassies.
Yes.
And these are, of course, very soft targets for a diplomatic assault on essentially establishing the facts on the ground in Jerusalem as the diplomatic capital of Israel. It's also the fact that these are countries that are much more permeable to different forms of corruption. And you're seeing the entry of American, but most certainly Israeli, Elbit and sort of Mekorot, which is now basically running half of the water distribution for Argentina, and it's promised to go into Chile as well, and it's promised to go into Uruguay as well. So it is really a degree of penetration, especially with this political alignment, which I must say is very reminiscent of the way in which a lot of the Israeli political machine on the right has actually penetrated European far-right operators, almost following the playbook. I mean, Farage, Orban, Meloni, and just keep counting.